You remember the cold of that floor. Not unpleasant, just specific. Tile, usually. Small octagonal tiles, white with the black ones scattered in here and there, or pink, or that pale mint green that nobody chooses anymore. And in the early morning, before the heat had come up through the rest of the house, that floor was cold against your bare feet in a way that woke you up faster than anything else could. And the light in there was its own kind of light, not bright exactly, soft, slightly yellow, coming from a single fixture above the mirror or from two small sconces on either side of the glass, and it made everyone look the same particular way, a little tired, a little soft around the edges, entirely human. This was the room nobody photographed. Nobody saved pictures of the bathroom, and yet you remember it more precisely than you remember almost any other room in the house you grew up in. The bathroom held the smallest rituals of your life, and the smallest rituals are the ones that never let go. This is about that room, the American bathroom before 1980, before it became a spa, before it became a showroom, back when it was simply the room with the cold tile and the soft light and the things in it that nobody thought to name because everybody already knew exactly what they were. Think about what that room actually held. Not luxury, not anything chosen for how it would photograph, just the accumulated, unremarkable evidence of a family living its ordinary life. One bar of soap, one good towel set, one medicine cabinet that had grown a little fuller every year since the day the family moved in. Houses were smaller then, and so the bathroom was smaller too, often the only bathroom in the entire house, shared by everyone, which meant it carried the trace of every single person who lived there. Your father's shaving cream on the edge of the sink, your mother's bobby pins gathered in a small dish, your own height marked once in pencil on the doorframe just outside, though that mark belonged to the hallway and not the room itself. There was a particular kind of waiting that happened outside that door on a Sunday morning when 6 people needed the same small room before church and only one person could be inside it at a time. Someone always knocked, someone always called out, "Just a minute," through the door. 30 of those things. Let's go back in. The first thing you saw when you walked in, before anything else, was the toilet paper. Not the toilet paper itself, the way it sat, often on a small chrome holder mounted into the tile wall, sometimes a simple bar, sometimes a fancier version with a small lid that flipped open. And in some houses, especially the ones with a little more care put into them, there was a spare roll sitting on top of the toilet tank, standing upright like a small sentry, or wrapped in a crocheted cover that someone's grandmother had made, a little doll-shaped cover, a poodle, a southern belle in a hoop skirt, her crocheted dress fanning out to hide the spare roll underneath. The crocheted toilet paper cover. You forgot that existed until just now. Somebody made that with her own hands. Somebody thought the back of the toilet needed something pretty on it, even though no guest would ever see it, even though it served no purpose except to be looked at by the people who already lived there. That was the quiet logic of the whole room. Things were made nice, not for show, but simply because making things nice was what you did, even in private, even where nobody else would ever notice. Number 2 was the medicine cabinet itself. Not a drawer, not an under-sink cabinet hidden behind a door, a mirrored cabinet built right into the wall above the sink, recessed so it sat flush, with a small chrome latch or a magnetic catch that clicked shut with a particular small sound. You opened it, and the mirror swung toward you, and behind it were shelves, usually 3, sometimes 4, made of thin glass or metal, slightly too narrow, crowded with bottles and tubes that had accumulated over years without anyone ever throwing anything away. The click of that magnetic latch, the way the mirror caught the light differently as it swung open. You knew every shelf of that cabinet by heart, in the dark, without looking. The aspirin on the left, the thermometer in its case behind the cough syrup, your father's razor blades in their small paper sleeves, stacked in a tidy column nobody else was allowed to touch.
That cabinet was a kind of family record, though nobody thought of it that way. Every bottle in it told you something about who had been sick, who had been hurt, who needed something soothed. A quiet history written in brand names and half-empty containers.
Number 3 was Mercurochrome, a small glass bottle with an orange-red liquid inside and a little glass applicator built into the cap, a thin glass rod that you touched to the bottle and then to your scraped knee, and it stung for one sharp second and then turned your skin a bright, almost theatrical orange that lasted for days. Every mother had a bottle. Every scraped knee in America in the 1950s and 1960s got the same orange paint. The sting, the orange stain on your skin that you showed off at school the next day like a badge. Nobody asked if it actually worked. It just felt like it did. That was enough. You'd run inside with a skinned knee, breathless, and your mother would already be reaching for that bottle before you'd even finished explaining what happened. She knew the routine as well as you did. Sit on the edge of the tub, hold still, 1 second of sting. Then it was over, and somehow so was the crying. Number 5 was the medicine cabinet's permanent resident, the bottle of iodine, dark brown orange, with its own tiny glass dauber, sitting next to the Mercurochrome because every house needed both, for reasons nobody quite explained, and you simply accepted that some scrapes got the orange and some got the darker brown, and either way it stung, and either way your mother blew on it gently afterward. She blew on it every single time. You don't know why that helped, it just did. Maybe it didn't do anything at all scientifically, but the gesture itself was the medicine in a way that mattered just as much as the iodine. A breath, cool against the sting, and a voice saying it would feel better in a minute, and it always did. Number 5 was the box of Band-Aids with the picture on the front, usually a child running or a small illustration of a bandage being applied to a knee, and inside, the strips themselves, beige, the same beige for everyone, regardless of skin color, because nobody had thought yet to make more than one shade. The tin or cardboard box sat on the same shelf for years, slowly emptying, the cardboard going soft at the corners from humidity. The smell of the adhesive when you peeled the wrapper open, a very specific smell. You'd recognize it anywhere, even now. You picked at the edge of the Band-Aid for days afterward, testing whether the scrape underneath had healed enough to peel it off, and your mother always told you to leave it alone, and you almost never did.
Number 6 was the jar of Vicks VapoRub. Blue glass, or later a blue plastic jar with that unmistakable smell of menthol and eucalyptus that hit you before the lid was even fully off. Rubbed onto your chest at night when you had a cold, sometimes onto the soles of your feet with socks pulled on over it because someone's mother swore that worked better than anything a doctor could give you. The smell of Vicks meant you were being taken care of. It meant you were going to be put to bed and checked on. Vicks VapoRub on your chest, wool socks pulled over it. You can still smell it if you try. That smell meant somebody loved you enough to stay up and worry. You'd lie in bed afterward, breathing in that sharp menthol cloud rising off your own skin, and somewhere down the hall you could hear your mother moving through the house, checking the thermostat, checking on you one more time before she finally went to bed herself. Number 7 was Noxzema. A short, squat, blue jar with white lettering, the cream inside thick and white and smelling sharply of camphor and menthol, a smell so specific it is almost impossible to describe to anyone who didn't grow up with it sitting on the edge of a sink. Used to remove makeup, used on sunburn, used by teenage girls trying to clear up their skin before a Friday night, used by mothers who had used it since they were teenage girls themselves. The cold of Noxzema against sunburned shoulders in July, the particular sharp smell that filled the whole bathroom when the lid came off. You can close your eyes right now and smell it. That jar moved between generations without anyone deciding it should. Your mother used the same jar her own mother had used, and you used it after her, and none of you ever discussed switching to anything else. Why would you? It worked. Number 8 was the can of Barbasol or Burma Shave shaving cream sitting on the edge of the sink where your father left it every morning. The can slightly rusted at the bottom rim from sitting in water that pooled there, the cream coming out with a soft hiss and immediately tripling in volume in his palm. The hiss of the can. The sound traveled through the house and told you your father was awake. You listened for it without realizing you were listening. Sometimes, if you were small enough and brave enough, you'd ask him for a little dab of the foam just to feel it in your palm, cool and light as a cloud, and he'd squirt out a small amount just for you, careful not to give you the razor too, and you'd stand there at the sink beside him, both of you lathered up, both of you part of the same morning ritual, even though only one of you actually needed to shave.
Number 9 was your father's straight razor or his double-edged safety razor. Kept in its own small stand or simply balanced on the edge of the sink and the leather strop hanging from a hook nearby if he was the kind of man who still sharpened his own blade. The sound of leather against steel, back and forth, a rhythm that belonged entirely to the morning. That sound, leather and steel, you associate it with the particular quiet of a house before everyone else woke up. You'd stand in the doorway sometimes, half asleep, just watching him work the blade against the leather, the rhythm unhurried, practiced, the same motion he'd probably learned from his own father, standing in some other doorway decades before. Number 10 was the bar of soap that never matched any other bar of soap in the house. Ivory, usually, because it floated, because the commercials said so, and because it was true. White and plain, and smelling like almost nothing at all, sitting in a small soap dish that had its own drainage holes so the bar didn't dissolve into a puddle. Ivory soap, 99 44/100% pure, the box said. You knew that number before you knew your own phone number. It floated in the bath. You always tested it, every single time, dropping it into the water and watching it bob there, white against the surface, as though it were proving something to you all over again, every bath, no matter how many times you'd already seen it happen. Number 11 was the bath mat. Not a plush modern one, but a rubber mat with small suction cups on the underside, often white or pale blue, sometimes with a daisy pattern punched through it, that stuck to the bottom of the tub with a particular squeak when you stepped on it, and pulled up at the corners over the years until someone finally noticed and bought a new one. The squeak of the rubber mat under wet feet, the way the suction cups eventually gave up one by one at the corners. You learned to step carefully around the corner that had come loose, the one everyone in the family knew about and nobody quite got around to fixing, because that was simply part of how that particular bathroom worked, its small imperfections as familiar as anything that functioned perfectly.
Number 12 was the Brillo pad, or the steel wool soap pad sitting in a small dish near the tub, used to scrub the ring of soap residue that formed around the waterline after every bath, the metal slowly rusting at the edges, leaving small orange flecks in the dish that someone wiped away without comment. Scrubbing the bathtub ring, a Saturday morning chore that smelled like steel and soap and effort. You'd be handed the pad and told to get it done before you could go outside and play, and you'd kneel there on the cold tile, working in small circles, watching the gray ring slowly disappear, and there was a particular satisfaction in that, a small job, finished completely, with visible proof that you had done it well. Number 13 was the box of bath salts or bubble bath, Mr. Bubble in its pink container with the round, smiling face, poured generously under the running tap, so the bubbles rose tall and white and slightly artificial smelling, a smell of bubble gum and something chemical underneath that you loved without question. Mr. Bubble's face on the bottle, the bubbles climbing higher than you thought possible. You played in there long after the water had gone cool.
Your mother would come in eventually and find you sitting in a tub gone lukewarm, bubbles collapsed down to a thin white film, your fingers wrinkled, and she'd shake her head and laugh and tell you it was time to get out, and you'd beg for 5 more minutes, and sometimes you got them. Number 14 was the rubber duck. Yellow, simple, with a small hole in the bottom that let in water you'd squeeze out later in a thin stream. No batteries, no sounds, nothing except a shape that floated and a face that smiled at you from the edge of the tub. The rubber duck, the small squeak it made if you squeezed it just right. It outlasted everything else in that bathroom. It's probably still in a box somewhere, faded slightly, the yellow gone a little dull, the small hole in its bottom still holding the same trapped water it held the last time anyone gave it a thought.
Number 15 was the washcloth. Not a fancy one, a thin square of terry cloth, often a color that had faded from years of bleach, hung over the edge of the tub or folded on the side of the sink, used and reused and washed and reused again, never thrown away until it was nearly transparent at the corners. Washcloths that outlived 3 changes of wallpaper. Nobody bought new ones often, you just kept the old ones going. There was no embarrassment in that, no sense of doing without. A worn, soft washcloth simply did its job better than a stiff new one ever could, and your mother knew that, and so the same handful of cloths circulated through that bathroom for years, faithful and unremarkable. Number 16 was the heavy glass tumbler beside the sink, often etched with a small floral pattern, used for rinsing your mouth after brushing your teeth, sometimes matching a soap dish and a toothbrush holder in the same pattern, a full bathroom set that someone had received as a wedding gift decades earlier and that had simply stayed unchanged ever since. The matching glass set, wedding china for the bathroom. Nobody thought that was strange. It had been a gift once, wrapped carefully, opened at a kitchen table surrounded by people who were mostly gone now, and it had quietly done its small daily job ever since, holding a toothbrush, holding a rinse of water, holding, in its own way, decades of ordinary mornings. Number 17 was the toothbrush holder mounted to the wall or sitting on the counter, with individual round holes for each family member's brush, the bristles splayed outward from years of use, everyone's brush a slightly different color so there was never any confusion about whose was whose. Everyone had their color. You knew your brush by sight from across the room. That small holder was a quiet map of the household, one slot for each person who lived there, never more, never fewer, and if someone moved out or grew up and left, the holder simply had one less brush in it, and somehow that absence was felt every single morning before anyone said a word about it.